How on earth did a prolific trafficker manage to completely dodge federal prison for over a decade? Seriously, it's a question that has baffled legal experts, journalists, and, pretty much everyone. How does someone just bypass serious federal consequences for so long? Especially when there's an absolute mountain of documented evidence against them. Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the massive, tangled web of the Jeffrey Epstein case. We're going to use official documents, investigative reports, and even the latest 2026 Truth Commission findings to untangle all of this. We'll look at the early legal loopholes that let him walk, all the way up to the modern-day push to finally get some real accountability. Here is how we're going to break it all down. First up, the early investigations. Then we'll unpack that infamous secret plea deal, followed by how journalism ultimately sparked a reckoning. After that, we'll cover the arrest and aftermath, and finally, the ongoing search for accountability today. Let's get right into it. Part 1, the early investigations. We're looking at the initial local and federal probes between 2005 and 2007. To really get a grip on this, we've got to look at the hard facts. The executive summary of the DOJ's Office of Professional Responsibility report is basically our ground truth here. It gives us a completely impartial lens to examine exactly how the legal system handled, or honestly, completely failed to handle this case in its earliest days. The timeline ramps up pretty fast. Back in 2005, Palm Beach police start investigating after the parents of a 14-year-old girl come forward. By 2006, a state grand jury indicts him for felony solicitation. But local police were beyond frustrated, right? They felt like the state charges didn't even scratch the surface of this massive criminal enterprise. So they handed over to the FBI. And by May 2007, an assistant U.S. attorney had drafted an absolute behemoth of a document, a 60-count federal indictment. It totally looked like a massive federal takedown was a sure thing. But, spoiler alert, that takedown didn't happen. Which brings us to Part 2, the secret plea deal. Let's look at the mechanics and the sheer controversy of the 2007 NPA. So what actually stopped that 60-count indictment in its tracks? A Non-Prosecution Agreement, or NPA. Then U.S. Attorney Alex Acosta signed a deal to drop the federal case in exchange for guilty pleas on much lighter state charges. But here's the wild part. It didn't just protect him. That NPA granted sweeping immunity to 4 named co-conspirators and, unbelievably, any unnamed potential co-conspirators. The disconnect here is just staggering. You've got the government signing this massive secret immunity deal in a back room, while the victims, they're entirely left in the dark. Literally, FBI administrative staff were mailing victims these generic form letters saying the case was still under investigation. So these victims falsely believed federal charges were still coming months after the secret deal was already a done deal. Now, Acosta eventually had to defend this to Congress. He argued that his office, quote, pursued a negotiated resolution rather than risking a full trial that might have failed. He pointed to jurisdictional issues and evidentiary hurdles, basically saying it was better to lock in a lenient state conviction than risk walking away with absolutely nothing in federal court. But hold on, because there's a huge legal problem with how this all went down. It's called the Crime Victims' Rights Act, or CVRA. It's a federal law that guarantees victims the right to confer with prosecutors before a plea deal is finalized. A federal judge later ruled that the government straight up violated this act by hiding the NPA from the victims. That total lack of transparency fundamentally broke the legitimacy of the whole agreement. And for over a decade, that paper trail stayed buried. That shifts us to Part 3, Journalism Sparks a Reckoning, looking at the 2018 investigative reporting. Fast forward to November 2018, and investigative journalist Julie K. Brown at the Miami Herald drops an absolute bombshell series called Perversion of Justice. She basically did what the justice system completely failed to do. She painstakingly tracked down over 60 women, documented their stories, and laid out the exact terms of that 2007 sweetheart deal for the whole world to see. It didn't just make headlines, it forced a legal and political reckoning that literally nobody could ignore anymore. The fallout was instant. Let's get into Part 4, Arrest and Aftermath, covering the 2019 indictment and the chaos that followed. Things moved incredibly fast after that expose. Federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York finally stepped in, and by July 2019, they indicted and arrested him on federal sex trafficking charges. The pressure was intense. That very same month, Alex Acosta, who was serving as U.S. Secretary of Labor by then, resigned because of the outrage over his role in the 2007 deal.
Then, just a month later, in August 2019, the main suspect is found dead in his Manhattan jail cell, which the medical examiner ruled a suicide. So, with the primary suspect dead, the specific indictment against him obviously gets dismissed. But the investigation? That definitely didn't stop. FBI summaries show that authorities immediately pivoted. They turned their attention right to the broader network, specifically zeroing in on his closest associate, Ghislaine Maxwell.
And that renewed federal focus really paid off. In December 2021, a jury convicted Ghislaine Maxwell on 5 counts, including sex trafficking of minors. A few months later, she was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. It was a massive milestone, for sure. But as we're about to see, putting one associate away was nowhere near the end of the story.
That brings us to our final chapter, Part 5, The Search for Accountability, looking at the 2026 Truth Commission and the push for transparency. With federal movement feeling slow, state governments are now stepping up. In 2026, the New Mexico Survivors Truth Commission dropped an interim report zeroing in on the massive 7,600-acre Zorro Ranch property. And the numbers here are wild. We're talking 50 employees, a $7 million payroll, and ironclad NDAs enforcing absolute silence. They logged 227 flights to the area, and 80 of those flights had literally no passenger names listed at all. It was a highly secretive, highly organized, logistical machine that law enforcement just ignored for decades. And the human cost of all these years of failure is just staggering. During the commission hearings, survivor Rachel Benavides gave this incredibly powerful testimony. She said, "New Mexico was treated like a ghost, while my survivor sisters continue to show up in Washington demanding accountability. There is a mountain of evidence this government has been sitting on for decades." It perfectly captures the pure frustration victims feel toward a system that just kept telling them to stand down. Well, that mountain of evidence is finally seeing the light of day. The 2026 Epstein Files Transparency Act forced the release of a mind-blowing 3.5 million pages of previously sealed DOJ documents. I mean, it's essentially crowdsourced the entire investigation now. Journalists, researchers, the general public, everyone is combing through emails, flight logs, and internal memos to see exactly how the government mishandled this for so long. And naturally, the media landscape is evolving right alongside all this new evidence. We've had the deep dive documentaries like Netflix's Filthy Rich focusing on the victims, and Hulu's Angels and Demons looking at the financial enablers. We've even seen biting satire like The Onion's 2025 project skewering how the true crime industry treated the case. But now, in 2026, we are seeing a totally new wave of projects actively using these unsealed documents to piece together the historical truth clearer than ever before. So, we've gone from backroom secret deals to a massive global demand for absolute transparency. But as these 3.5 million pages keep getting unsealed and picked apart, you've got to wonder, what other secrets are still hiding in that massive paper trail? And honestly, what are all these new revelations going to teach us about the really dangerous blind spots in our justice system?